The $10 trillion lie. How the USSR was bankrupt 10 years before it fell. The memo landed on the Kremlin desk at dawn, oil revenues collapsing, factories hitting quotas with goods nobody wanted, gold reserves thinning. "We can't pay our bills by spring," the line read. Outside, red banners still hung. Inside, the accountants knew the secret. This superpower was out of cash, but the public story? Growth, strength, progress. The real story began years earlier, in ledgers no one was supposed to read. To see how a giant died with a smile on its face, we need to go back to the charts that bent, the metrics that hid decay, and the people told to call crisis success. The mirage of growth, when numbers lied. Start with the headline that never made it to Pravda. The Soviet economy grew fastest when it measured itself by a yardstick designed to flatter. For decades, central planners reported net material product, NMP, counting what heavy industry produced and ignoring much of services. Tanks, turbines, and tons of steel dominated the scoreboard. The result looked like victory. Mid-century growth rates above 5%, second only to Japan, and charts shooting up through the 1960s. Inside ministries, managers learned the lesson early: meet the plan, maximize tonnage, and you'll be promoted. Whether anyone wanted the output was a different question. Here's the catch. By the early 1970s, the engine behind that growth had already begun to stall. Economists tracking total factor productivity, the efficiency with which capital and labor produced output, saw a slide. The miracle of moving millions from farms to factories had run its course. The easy gains of copying Western machinery slowed. What remained was a system that could still pile up numbers but struggled to create value. Meanwhile, the state's own numbers developed a habit. They hid what mattered. Managers faced quotas measured in gross indicators, tons, kilometers of pipeline, kilowatt hours, so they gamed the system. A pipeline built wider than needed met the plan. Heavier but obsolete machine tools met the plan. Warehouses filled with unsold spare parts met the plan. A factory director could ship unrequested inputs to another plant on December 31st and count it as fulfillment. The receiving plant, lacking storage, sent them back in January and booked its own plan as received. On paper, both succeeded. In the stores, consumers stared at empty shelves. The mirage deepened because prices weren't prices. In a command economy, planners set them. A ton of steel could be priced generously. A refrigerator barely covered its cost. The state then celebrated output that under world prices would have been a loss. When outside analysts tried to translate Soviet NMP into GDP, the gap widened. Declassified assessments painted a sobering picture. Higher military production masked stagnant consumer sectors. Services that made modern economies dynamic simply didn't register. The Soviet yardstick graded the wrong exam, and yet the triumphal story marched on. The system rewarded reports, not results. Every link of the chain had an incentive to embellish. Regional committees, ministries, enterprises. An honest shortfall meant punishment. A creative adjustment meant survival. Quality slipped because quality didn't count. Bearings failed early. Tractors broke down. New equipment arrived as refurbished relics. The 1960s push to modernize by upgrading old capital often just consumed resources with negligible gains. Money was spent. The plan was fulfilled. Productivity barely budged. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union hit another wall. Resource costs climbed. The iron mines dug deeper. The oil fields crept into harsher terrain. The coal seams got thinner. Extraction needed more steel, more energy, more transport. Inputs that the plan labeled as heroic output. In truth, the economy was burning more fuel to stand still. The Ricardian trap had arrived, but the statistical system obscured it by counting costs as achievements. A second strand of the mirage ran through the consumer's daily life. Official consumption statistics claimed high calorie intake, comparable to the West, but calorie charts didn't capture cues, substitution, and quality. A family might secure calories as bread and potatoes while meat, fruit, and fresh dairy were scarce. The line outside a store was a shadow ledger, measuring shortages the plan never recorded. When black markets blossomed, they revealed prices that planners refused to see. The true exchange value of goods. But those prices were illegal facts, and illegal facts didn't enter the plan. Inside the defense complex, numbers had their own disguise. The share of national output devoted to the military was buried in euphemisms and off-budget accounting. Best estimates put the load at an extraordinary share of the economy, crowding out investment in new civilian capital, in infrastructure, in human capital. The military-industrial complex delivered technical feats, but outside those closed cities, the civilian machine aged. A state could maintain the silhouette of superpower by counting missiles. It couldn't maintain living standards by counting missiles. Glasnost later let a few voices admit what had been whispered. The growth slowdown had begun years before the headlines changed. Total factor productivity was negative in key sectors. New investment went to replace worn-out equipment, not to expand capacity or raise efficiency. The plan kept getting fulfilled. The economy kept losing steam. One micro-story captures it. A factory manager paid to hit output stocks a warehouse with valves that don't fit the pipelines actually being built. He knows they won't be used. He also knows the plan was met. The ministry signs off. The report shows progress. The pipeline team downriver improvises a workaround with older parts. Both managers protect themselves. The statistician notes rising industrial output. The nation gets a brittle system, impressive on paper, fragile in practice. By the early 1980s, the distance between the ledger and the street had become a chasm. The state's miracle metrics kept pointing up, but the signals that matter in any economy, price, profit, loss, demand, were muffled or missing, replaced by planned targets that told people how to act and told leaders what they wanted to hear. The Mirage wasn't just fuzzing the view, it was steering decisions. Investments flowed to where indicators were easiest to fulfill, not where value was created. In that sense, the numbers didn't just lie about the future, they helped kill it. Oil lifeline. The 1973-1986 Windfall. To understand how the ledgers stayed sunny while the engine coughed, follow the pipeline. In 1973, the world oil price jumped. For Moscow, it was oxygen. Hard currency poured in from Western Europe's refineries and the Comecon clients who paid in rubles but freed up Soviet barrels for sale abroad. The miracle metrics suddenly had a cash register attached. Dollars meant imports, and imports covered sins. When domestic machinery broke, Western equipment bridged the gap. When grain harvests failed, American wheat arrived. The balance sheets looked healthier not because factories became efficient, but because global prices turned favorable. Inside the ministries, oil receipts became policy. The planners didn't change their yardsticks, they changed how they paid the bill. Instead of fixing incentives, they wrote checks. The 1970s revenue surge bought time, and with it illusions. Credit lines opened in European banks. Bank quietly expanded hard currency borrowing to finance equipment, grain, and technology. The defense complex hummed undisturbed, shielded by the petrodollar cushion. On paper, investment remained high. In practice, much of it replaced worn-out capital, while the newest capital came off foreign docks. Meanwhile, the countryside told a harder story. Collectivized agriculture still underperformed. After the early shock of collectivization, harvests rose with more tractors and fertilizers, but under the surface, the incentive problem lingered. Private plots, tiny in acreage, continued to deliver outsized shares of meat and vegetables. The state farms absorbed inputs and produced output measured in gross tonnage. Yet by the 1970s, the grain trap was obvious to anyone reading the import invoices. The USSR became one of the world's largest grain buyers, paying in dollars it earned from oil. The famous 1972 grain deal with the United States, what traders later dubbed the Great Grain Robbery, was an early sign. Through the decade, these purchases weren't a one-off rescue, they were a yearly patch. The windfall also masked the creeping cost of extraction. Western Siberia's oilfields were prolific, but they weren't cheap forever. As fields matured, the Soviet Union pushed farther into harsh terrain. New pipelines snaked across permafrost. Steel, compressors, and pumps, many sourced from abroad, were consumed at rising rates. In the statistical yearbooks, all that counted as output. In the balance of payments, it showed up as imports funded by previous oil cargoes. The plan celebrated tonnage. The accountants watched margins thin. Abroad, détente gave Moscow more buyers. Western Europe wanted gas and crude. The Soviets wanted turbines and chemical plants. Deals were struck, long-term gas contracts in exchange for pipelines and compressors. It looked like reciprocity, and in some ways it was. But the deeper trade was this. The Soviet system swapped present resource rents for temporary relief from its structural inefficiencies. Instead of reforming price signals or enterprise autonomy, it traded barrels for time. Inside the Politburo, the numbers seemed to say the model worked. Growth rates slowed but didn't collapse. Shelves still suffered shortages, but showcase stores in Moscow improved modestly. Consumer durables, televisions, refrigerators trickled in. Meanwhile, military procurement stayed sacrosanct. Estimates from Western analysts put defense outlays at a very high share of national output, often cited in the mid-teens to mid-20s%, deep enough to crowd out civilian modernization if the windfall ever ended. As long as oil held, the bill could be paid with fewer visible sacrifices. There was a second effect, subtler and more dangerous. The windfall entrenched habits. Enterprise directors learned that spare parts could be obtained with hard currency imports rather than better domestic coordination. Ministries learned that shortfalls could be erased with purchases abroad rather than by changing incentives at home. The black market revealed true scarcities, but the official answer came from foreign catalogs, not domestic reform. Hard currency became the lubricant for a planned machine that otherwise seized. Then, from 1981 to 1985, the warning lights. Global oil markets softened as non-OPEC production rose and demand growth cooled. The floor still held, but cracks showed. And in 1986, the floor gave way. A supply surge and price war drove the Brent benchmark down sharply. For the Soviet budget, this was a guillotine. Suddenly, the external subsidy vanished. Hard currency earnings plunged just as import dependency had solidified. The central bank could sell gold. Reserves had long been a quiet buffer, but bullion sales can't repair incentives. Bank could borrow, but creditors read the same price charts. What the Kremlin memos now revealed, what the public didn't see, was a cash flow shock layered on structural decay. Defense could not be touched easily. Agriculture still needed foreign grain. Industry still needed Western inputs to keep decrepit lines running. The hard choices appeared: cut civilian imports, raid reserves, or admit the plan's numbers had never reflected value. Leadership tried to do all three without saying so. Consumer imports shrank, queues lengthened, spare parts disappeared, gold shipments increased. Here's where the Mirage met the market. In the plan, a ton of steel equaled a ton of steel. In the world market, a barrel priced at $12 couldn't pay for the same list of imports a $30 barrel did. The mechanism that had let Moscow paper over inefficiency evaporated. The bills came due, not in ideology, but in invoices. And the accounts showed something brutal. Without high oil prices, the system's internal cash generation was too weak to sustain its promises. The oil lifeline didn't cause the disease, it hid it. For 13 years, windfall rents gave the Soviet model a pass on reform, and they trained its managers to expect a bailout from geology. When the price fell, the subsidies the system paid to itself, cheap energy, overstaffed factories, mispriced inputs, no longer had an external sponsor. The accountant's secret became the country's fate. 1986 oil crash. Math turns against Moscow. The graph broke like a bone. In early 1986, Brent slid into the teens, then brushed $10.12 a barrel. For a system that had turned oil into oxygen, this wasn't a bad quarter, it was asphyxiation. Hard currency earnings, long propped up by petroleum, fell by billions almost overnight. The accountants who'd used oil receipts to cover the gap between plan and reality now faced arithmetic that refused to be negotiated. Every shipment out bought fewer lifelines back in. Inside Bank, ledgers that had absorbed years of purchases, grain, machine tools, chemical plants, lost their cushion. Existing commitments didn't pause because prices fell. Western suppliers still expected payment, interest still ticked. The Soviet Union could and did sell more volume, but the global glut meant volumes didn't rescue revenues. On the budget side, ministries that had quietly relied on oil windfalls to fund deficits were told to tighten. Cutting military procurement was politically close to impossible. Cutting civilian imports was immediate and visible. What nobody outside those rooms saw in the headlines was the triage list. Grain first, because bread rations were non-negotiable. Machinery second, because whole industrial chains depended on a steady drip of Western parts keeping worn Soviet equipment alive. Consumer durables last, because televisions could wait in theory. By the summer of 1986, wait became vanish. Queues lengthened. Black market prices rose, revealing scarcity that official price tags refused to acknowledge. It wasn't ideology that changed, it was invoices. The country felt the absence. The leadership turned to gold. For years, bullion had been a silent buffer, converted to dollars when seasonal needs spiked. Now sales accelerated. The state bank discreetly sold into London and Zurich to bridge gaps in the balance of payments. Gold bought time, but at a cost. The reserve that signaled strength became a pawn in weekly cash flow. The signal to creditors was unmistakable. Lines of credit tightened, tenors shortened, and the premium for Soviet risk crept up. Meanwhile, the energy sector itself was an expensive patient. Western Siberian fields needed capital to sustain output as pressures fell and wells aged. New drilling into harsher zones required compressors, turbines, and control systems, a shopping list that since the 1970s had leaned on Western suppliers. After the Toshiba-Kongsberg scandal, access to cutting-edge gear was constrained. After the price collapse, the money to buy even permitted technology thinned. The Ministry of Oil Industry was told to maintain output with less. Managers cannibalized equipment, ran pumps longer, deferred maintenance. It kept barrels moving, but reliability slipped. The export mix tilted toward volume over value. Inside Gosplan, a different reckoning began. The plan had always conflated inputs with success: more steel, more energy, more tonnage. But 1986 exposed a truth the statistics hid. If a ton of exported crude earned half the dollars, the same input regime generated fewer tradable resources to fund the rest of the economy. The internal accounting, denominated in rubles and targets, couldn't square that circle. The external account, denominated in dollars, demanded an answer. The planners tried to reallocate, but the command system was slow. Enterprises kept producing to old quotas because deviation meant punishment. Warehouses filled with the wrong goods while stores ran out of the right one. At the same time, the arms race meter kept running. Western estimates pegged defense at an enormous share of national output, deep enough that under oil stress it crowded everything else. Afghanistan still consumed resources and lives. The defense-industrial complex, insulated by secrecy and prestige, had priority on materials and skilled labor. Civilian industries, already aging, lost further ground. Perestroika was being discussed, but talk didn't free up bearings, microchips, or lubricants. There were human markers for the macro shift. A port dispatcher in Odessa watched refrigerated containers arrive late and leave half empty as foreign suppliers cut shipments and buyers tightened terms. A factory in Tolyatti received word that imported components would be rationed. Managers rewrote production plans twice in a month and sent workers home on idle days. A Leningrad mother, used to supplementing the state store with farmers' markets, found prices there jumping as shortages rippled outward. Each was an entry in a ledger. The plan didn't keep. The government tried multiple patches. Price reforms were floated to address hidden inflation. Partial enterprise autonomy was expanded in the hope that local initiative would raise efficiency. But 1986 wasn't a laboratory year. It was a liquidity crisis layered on structural rot. Giving a director more leeway didn't conjure bearings that didn't exist or foreign exchange that wasn't earned. When prices were nudged, money chased scarcity, queues shortened only to be replaced by empty shelves. The state's credibility took a hit because promises now collided with daily experience. Foreign policy narrowed to economics. Gas for pipelines deals with Europe held long-term take-or-pay contracts begun in the 1970s, 1980s, providing a steadier stream than oil, but those contracts couldn't fill the hole alone. The ruble remained non-convertible. Internal prices and wages floated in a universe separate from the world market. Closing that gap would require either devaluation and shock or prolonged austerity and reform. Politically, neither route was prepared. Administratively, the machine wasn't built for abrupt course changes. The accountants' memos turned blunt. Without higher prices or deep cuts, external payments would strain to breaking. Defense was protected. Social spending had political constituencies. Subsidies to loss-making enterprises were embedded. That left the thin layer of imports that greased the whole system. Cut them and breakdowns multiplied. Keep them and reserves bled. 1986 forced the choice into the open, even if no one admitted it on television. This was the hinge. For 13 years, oil's generosity had covered mispricing, misallocation, and missed reforms. In 1986, the math reversed the subsidy. After that, every month the country lived a little more on memories and a little less on margins. And once a system starts selling its future to fund its present, the end is already scheduled. Energy hunger. Oil and coal efficiency slide. While the price collapse shredded the balance of payments, something deeper was already eating the core. It took more energy every year to get energy. The country that bragged about output in tons and barrels was quietly losing the return on each ton and barrel it produced. To see it follow a mine shaft down. In the 1960s, iron ore and coal came from shallower seams in European Russia and Ukraine. Haul distances were short, equipment simpler, winters milder. By the 1970s and early 1980s, pits in Kursk and Kryvyi Rog had deepened, overburden climbed, conveyor runs lengthened. Every meter down meant more explosives, more electricity for hoists, more spare parts for crusher. The plan called those inputs achievements. Megawatts consumed, ton-kilometers moved. The engineer on the night shift called them what they were, rising costs to stand still. Coal told the same story. The Donbass seams that had fueled Soviet steel since the 193s were exhausted in their easiest sections. Output shifted to deeper, gassier faces and to remote basins in Kuzbass. Each new ton demanded more roof supports, more ventilation, more diesel for underground haulage, and more safety downtime after methane spikes. Meanwhile, aging equipment lingered because managers couldn't stop lines long enough to replace them without missing quota. The 1960s, modernization drive had refurbished fleets without redesigning flows. By the 1980s, breakdowns multiplied and cannibalization became policy. On paper, coal output targets held. In practice, each unit of coal delivered required more steel, more labor, and more kilowatt-hours than a decade before. Oil's story was bigger and harsher. Western Siberia, Samatler above all, changed the nation's fortunes in the late 1960s and 1970s. Those were flush fields, high pressure, generous flow, but reservoirs age. Water cut rises, pressures fall, wells need artificial lift, and secondary recovery becomes standard. By the early 1980s, Samatler was showing classic decline symptom. To stabilize production, ministries ordered intensive drilling campaigns and stepped up water injection. That meant more rigs, more casing, more pumps, more chemicals, and more power to push water in and lift fluids out. It looked heroic in the annual report. Hundreds of new wells drilled, kilometers of new gathering lines laid, thousands of tons of equipment installed. In economic terms, the energy return on energy invested was sliding. There was a geographic tax, too. The frontier moved north and east into permafrost, taiga, and swamps. Foundations had to be insulated. Pipelines needed heating stations. Winter access required ice roads and specialized vehicles. Every meter of pipe across the Ob or the tundra ate steel and electricity. Compressors that kept gas moving across thousands of kilometers into Europe had to fight physics and temperature, and they drew heavily from a power grid already strained. The plan counted the electricity those compressors consumed as production. The accountant who tried to price it at world cost would have called it what it was, a margin killer. What nobody admitted in speeches was that the energy sector's gross growth masked a net squeeze. If the oil ministry pumped 2 million more tons but burned an extra 100 million kilowatt-hours, thousands more tons of steel, and imported critical compressors to do it, the net contribution to the rest of the economy could stagnate or fall. The Soviet metrics didn't track net energy or net value, they tracked heroic effort. That's how ministries learned to survive, by demonstrating effort. Meanwhile, coal's rising cost hit railways, another hidden sink. Longer hauls from Kuzbass to Ural steelworks and from remote pits to power plants soaked up locomotives and wagons. Turnaround slowed as maintenance lagged, and the system compensated by keeping rolling stock moving longer at lower reliability. Rail power plants burned more coal to move coal. Again, the plan recorded movement as success. Managers tried to economize where they could, but the incentive structure pushed the other way. A director who requested fewer inputs risked missing output targets. A director who demanded more inputs to ensure plan fulfillment was prudent. When energy intensity rose, the rational bureaucratic move was to ask for more electricity quotas, more diesel allocations, more steel allotments. Across ministries, the safest response to inefficiency was scale. And scaling, an inefficient process, deepened the trap. This energy hunger bled into foreign accounts. To keep fields flowing and mines open, ministries ordered Western pumps, drill bits, turbines, and control systems, precisely the items that COCOM controls scrutinized and, after scandals, increasingly restricted. When oil prices were high, those imports were manageable. After 1986, they became a knife at the budget's throat. The country needed more foreign gear to extract each marginal barrel that now earned fewer dollars. That is what the accountants meant when they warned that math, not ideology, was closing in. There were micro-stories behind the macro. A shift supervisor at Samatler signed off on 5 workovers in a week after pump failures. The spare parts locker was empty, so crews stripped components from lower flow wells to keep high flow wells alive. In Kuzbas, an electrical engineer begged for new switchgear to prevent arc faults underground. His ministry allotted refurbished units that tripped irregularly, forcing costly stoppages. In Vorkuta, permafrost heave-warped a conveyor foundation. Maintenance improvised shims to make it through winter. Each decision preserved output for the month and dug the system deeper into energy inefficiency. By the mid-1980s, the net result was unavoidable in the numbers the public never saw. More of the nation's total capacity, steelmaking, machine building, electricity, was being consumed to feed the energy sector itself. The sectors that could have renewed civilian life, housing materials, transport upgrades, consumer durables, were crowded not only by defense, but by energy's own appetite. The economy had become a snake eating its tail, and every additional ton that proved plan fulfillment took another bite. The grain trap, buying bread with dollars to see how a superpower mortgaged dinner start in the fields. The Soviet Union could mobilize for steel and space, but bread still came from soil and incentives. Collectivized farms had land and machinery. They lacked ownership and feedback. Work teams met acreage and tonnage targets, not profit. Inputs, fertilizer, diesel, spare parts arrived late or wrong. When rain ruined a harvest, there was no price signal to reallocate. There was a decree and a new quota. Private garden plots, a sliver of the acreage, quietly produced outsized shares of meat, eggs, and vegetables because people kept what they grew. The system's scoreboard didn't reward that, so it kept scaling what didn't work. The bill landed in Chicago. In 1972, Soviet buyers quietly swept U.S. grain under long-term contracts at subsidized prices, the Great Grain Robbery. Washington only realized later that Moscow's crop shortfall was worse than advertised. The ships kept coming because they had to. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the USSR became one of the world's largest grain importers. It wasn't a one-off rescue, it was policy. Wheat, corn, and soybeans sailed from American Gulf ports and Canadian terminals into Black Sea harbors, paid for with hard currency earned from oil and gold. Inside the planning apparatus, this made perverse sense. Food was political. Bread queues could topple mayors and shake ministries. If oil dollars could turn into grain that stabilized cities, you spent them. But each cargo was a confession. The command system couldn't feed itself reliably, even with some of the richest farmland on Earth. Tractors rolled, combines cut, and still the state bought bread abroad. The mechanics were unforgiving. Collective farms absorbed massive inputs, mechanization, fertilizer, irrigation, yet yields lagged behind comparable Western operations. Managers hit gross output targets by harvesting early to avoid missing quotas, even if moisture penalties ruined the crop's quality. Storage losses were chronic, silos leaked, handling equipment broke. Transport bottlenecks meant grain sat in sidings for days, molding before it reached mills. None of this showed up where it mattered for promotion. The plan counted tons harvested. It didn't dock points for tons spoiled. Hard currency turned all that hidden waste into a visible cost. Oil at $30 made the grain habit tolerable. Oil in the teens turned it into a crisis. Each import tender forced a trade-off with machinery, chemicals, and consumer goods also competing for dollars. Vneshekonombank wired payments to U.S. exporters while ministries begged for credit lines to keep factory lines running. The food bill had seniority. That meant a lathe in Sverdlovsk might go without bearings, but bread would be baked in Moscow. There was a diplomatic tax, too. Grain tied Moscow to suppliers it publicly denounced. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Washington debated embargoes after Afghanistan. Even partial restrictions tightened Moscow's math. To hedge, the Soviets diversified toward Argentina, Canada, and Australia, but shipping distances rose, freight costs climbed, and quality varied. The supply chain extended just as the budget strained. Meanwhile, the domestic fix that might have eased the trap, paying farmers real prices, allowing market-oriented procurement or freeing distribution, ran into the system's ideology and muscle memory. Raising procurement prices improved output on the margins, but it also blew up budgets because subsidized bread prices at the store didn't move. The state ate the difference. Allowing more private trade officially risked admitting the black market had solved problems the plan couldn't. Politically, that was hard. Administratively, it was dangerous for careers built on control. On the ground, the contradictions were human. A combined driver in Stavropol hit his quota by cutting on a schedule that ignored moisture content. Millers downstream cursed the clogged screens and lower flour extraction. A city bakery manager, told to maintain rations, received flour with inconsistent quality and compensated by mixing in more imported grain. Loaves shrank slightly and customers noticed. A port stevedore in Novorossiysk watched American wheat arrive just as local shipments were rejected for contamination. Everyone did their job. The system still bought bread with dollars. Hidden inside the grain trade was a feedback loop that hardened bad habits. The more the state covered shortfalls with imports, the less pressure there was to reform land tenure, procurement, and logistics. Farm directors learned that pleading weather and equipment shortages could be patched from abroad. Ministries learned that a short letter to Vneshekonombank was easier than tackling middlemen skimming at every stage. Oil's windfall subsidized agricultural inefficiency just as it did industrial inefficiency. After 1986, that subsidy evaporated. Then the math turned personal. Urban families who had always relied on bread as the anchor of their diet watched queues lengthen and bakery hours tighten. Rumors about import delays spread faster than official announcements. Housewives formed informal networks to track deliveries. Black market bread appeared at painful prices, revealing again the real scarcity the plan refused to price. In the countryside, resentment simmered. Farmers saw imported grain displace their harvest in city ovens while their own inputs were rationed. The grain trap wasn't just that the USSR bought wheat abroad. It was that the purchases signaled a deeper truth. The command system couldn't match incentives to outcomes in the one sector where politics demanded success. When oil covered the bill, the country could pretend the flaw was temporary. After the crash, every shipload was a reminder that the old ledgers were lying. Bread had turned into a balance of payments item. And when a regime starts financing breakfast with bullion and borrowed dollars, the end of the story is already written in the bakery's flour dust. Innovation blocker, tech stagnation mechanics. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the workshops that should have powered a turnaround. The Soviet Union could reverse engineer almost anything. It struggled to invent the next thing, not because engineers weren't talented, they were, but because the system they worked in strangled feedback and starved risk. Start with the rewards. A factory director's safest path was to meet the plan with yesterday's design. Changing a product meant halting a line, missing targets, and inviting punishment. Even approved innovations carried penalties. A new model's teething problems could tank monthly fulfillment, so managers delayed adoption until the end of a reporting period or faked upgrades by adding weight or cosmetic features that didn't compromise throughput. Innovation became an accounting hazard. Then there were the inputs. Modern electronics, machine tools, and precision bearings were exactly the items COCOM controls restricted. After the Toshiba Kongsberg scandal mid-1980s, when Western firms were caught selling restricted milling and propeller technology that aided Soviet submarine quieting, the pipeline narrowed further. Legal channels delivered older vintages. Illegal channels were costly and unreliable. Ministries built shadow projects to replicate Western kit, but without market feedback and with procurement driven by quotas, clones lagged years behind. The military sector could hoard scarce components. Civilian sectors made do with substitutes. The gap widened. Inside design bureaus, brilliance met bureaucracy. A team in Zelenograd could architect a microchip family. Getting it into mass production meant negotiating with ministries that allocated clean rooms, chemicals, and test equipment by plan, not by potential. If a bureau won the allocation, it then faced another barrier. Enterprise directors reluctant to retool lines for a component that might fail to arrive in volume. Meanwhile, black markets paid engineers for moonlighting, draining time from state projects. The incentives were coherent for individuals and disastrous for innovation. What nobody knew at the time, outside a few circles, was how much the measurement problem fed this stagnation. The plan rewarded gross indicators, units shipped, tons produced. Quality metrics were crude, often gamed, and rarely tied to user satisfaction. A consumer electronics plant could hit targets by producing televisions with high failure rates so long as the count was right. Service networks, underfunded and under-incentivized, couldn't create the feedback loops that drive iterative improvement. The result was a culture of one-off launches and chronic underperformance. The defense complex was a paradox. It produced world-class rockets and respectable avionics in silos of excellence. But those islands didn't become archipelagos. The spillover into civilian life was limited because secrecy, compartmentalization, and classification walls blocked diffusion. A guidance system algorithm might exist in a closed city. The civilian computer industry couldn't access the people, let alone the code. When it did, production-scale constraints and component shortages wasted the insight. The state could command a moonshot. It couldn't mass-produce a reliable washing machine with the same discipline. There was also the matter of finance. Enterprises didn't go bankrupt for failing to meet consumer demand. They received soft budget constraints and subsidies. Banks didn't allocate capital based on expected returns. They executed planned directives. Price signals that tell innovators where value lies were muffled. A director who took a leap on a new process risked planned failure. A director who stuck with the known risked nothing. The calculus was rational survival. The aggregate was stasis. Meanwhile, global technology sprinted ahead. Japan perfected just-in-time manufacturing and high-precision machine tools. The West integrated microprocessors into everything. The USSR tried to copy, but copying requires more than blueprints. It requires complementary ecosystems. Suppliers who can deliver to spec, distributors who can respond to demand shifts, service networks that feed information back to designers. The command system's siloed ministries blocked these horizontal connections. Managers bargained vertically with their supervising ministry. They did not build lateral relationships with suppliers and customers beyond what the plan prescribed. The emergent complexity that sparks innovation was planned out of existence. 3 days earlier, something strange occurred in a Minsk tractor plant. An engineer proposed a redesign that would cut fuel consumption by 5%. The math was solid, the parts were available. The director paused. The current model met quotas and used established supply lines. Switching would require retraining, a temporary shutdown, and the risk of teething failures. The director filed the idea under next year and shipped the old tractor. 5% fuel savings vanished into the queue, multiplied across thousands of machines. Unknown to them, across town, a consumer electronics shop manager kept a notebook of returns. A batch from one factory failed at triple the usual rate. He sent a report up the chain. Months later, the factory received a reprimand, not a resource allocation to fix the line. The manager learned a lesson. Documenting failure brought attention, not help. He stopped counting. The feedback loop died. The 1987 law on state enterprise tried to loosen the grip. More autonomy, limited self-financing. But autonomy without markets mostly meant directors negotiated harder with ministries while still chasing quotas. Profit as a metric drifted in a sea of distorted prices. When prices on inputs were fixed and outputs were subsidized, internal profit told you more about a ministry's transfer than about value creation. Managers learned to seek favorable plan assignments and price ratios, not customers. This was the moment everything changed from slowdown to sclerosis. As oil dollars dried up and imports faltered, the system had to rely on domestic innovation to stretch scarce inputs. That required flexibility, fast feedback, and risk-taking. Instead, the incentive grid pushed in the opposite direction. The best minds solved constrained problems in defense. The rest solved bureaucratic problems in production. The machine that once caught up by copying found it couldn't even copy fast enough. In the aftermath, the country looked at its shelves and its machines and realized something brutal. Talent wasn't the issue. Permission was. And by the time permission came, in halting reforms and half-open markets, the cash was gone, the patience was gone, and the world had moved on. Glasnost perestroika. Opening reveals the gap. The first shock wasn't a riot. It was a statistic read aloud on television. Under Glasnost, mid to late 1980s, numbers long buried in annexes started slipping into speeches. Managers who'd spent careers reporting fulfillment heard a new phrase, hidden inflation. Prices hadn't moved on paper, but shortages were doing the job for them. Perestroika promised acceleration, yet the first thing it accelerated was honesty. To understand why the reveal hit like a blow, remember what the model hid. For years, defense and heavy industry consumed the best metal, the best mines, the best machine time. Now, in reform meetings, economists showed charts. Civilian machinery was decades old. Consumer goods were stuck in designs no one wanted. The country had built a fortress and discovered the pantry was bare. When a senior official acknowledged that defense absorbed an extraordinary share of national output, the room went quiet. Nobody said the number in public. They didn't have to. People felt it in the empty shops. Perestroika tried to change how decisions were made. The 1987 law on state enterprise told directors they could set plans from below, keep more of their proceeds, and sign contracts beyond their ministries. In theory, autonomy would spark efficiency. In practice, autonomy collided with prices that still lied. If inputs were cheap by decree and outputs subsidized at the checkout, profit became a rationing coupon, not a signal. Directors learned fast. Chase favorable plan assignments, secure your supply, and push losses into the budget. The new freedom mostly changed who they argued with. Meanwhile, glasnost pulled back curtains. Newspaper stories detailed rusting equipment, fulfilled factories idled for lack of parts, and warehouses stuffed with obsolete inputs. Workers read about gold sales shoring up imports. They read about oil prices dismantling the budget. They read about grain bought with dollars. Then they looked at their kitchens. The contradiction became personal. The rhetoric said restructuring. The refrigerator said rationing. The reforms also opened a door that planners had tried to keep shut: cooperatives. Small private groups were allowed to trade, repair, even manufacture. A few months later, stalls appeared stacked with goods the state couldn't supply: spare parts, jeans, sausages, electronics. Prices were shocking because they were real. Wages, frozen in a world of fictitious prices, couldn't stretch. The state called it speculation. Shoppers called it survival. The black market came into the sun and made the gap visible. What things actually cost versus what the plan said they should. What nobody knew at the time was how deeply the old system fought back inside the reforms. Ministries kept control over key inputs: steel, energy, transport, so enterprise autonomy meant little when a director still needed a phone call to get a rail car. Gosplan's grip loosened, but no market replaced it. Managers were told to negotiate. They didn't have customers, only counterparties chasing their own quotas. Contracts proliferated, bottlenecks multiplied. It felt like freedom on paper and logjams in practice. There was a political clock ticking. Defense had constituencies, factories, cities, design bureaus tied to secure budgets. Cutting there required a strategy and a substitute. The leadership tried to squeeze around the edges, redirecting some machine building to civilian lines. But retooling costs money, and money was short. Oil receipts were down, gold was being sold, foreign creditors were cautious. The arsenal stayed funded, housing repairs didn't. Then came a gesture meant to build trust, revealing the truth about the books. Budget deficits were acknowledged, soft loans to loss-making enterprises were flagged, subsidies that kept bread cheap were costed in rubles. The public learned the state had been concealing a hole for years. It wasn't treason, it was math catching up. But trust is fragile. You can tell people the truth and lose them if the truth is that you can't deliver. On a factory floor in Sverdlovsk, a meeting ran past midnight. The director laid out the new rules. The plant could choose its suppliers, set bonuses, sign long-term contracts. A machinist raised his hand. With what? The bearings they needed came from a mill that now demanded cash, not quotas. The bank could issue credit, but rubles didn't buy the imported steel grade they required. The director nodded. We'll barter. Within weeks, barter chains emerged. Lathes for fuel oil, tires for grain, refrigerators for copper. It kept lines moving and undercut the very price system reformers were trying to build. While that was happening in Moscow, across the Union, republics tested sovereignty. If the center couldn't supply, they would keep more of what they produced. Inter-republic deliveries faltered. A textile plant in Lithuania lost cotton from Central Asia. A steel mill in Ukraine waited on coking coal from Kuzbas. The plan had been a web. Reforms turned it into a tug-of-war over threads. The timing was brutal. Just as the country needed coordination, the old command lost legitimacy and the new market hadn't formed. Gorbachev's circle split. One camp wanted deeper shock, free prices, hard budgets, convertible ruble. Another urged caution, pilot programs, gradualism, hold the line on staples. They compromised and got the worst of both. Enterprises faced sharper edges without real markets. Consumers saw prices rise unofficially while official prices held, creating shortages twice over. Money chased goods that didn't exist, queues lengthened, patience thinned. What nobody could say plainly from the podium was simple. The system had been subsidizing itself with oil, secrecy, and statistics. When glasnost turned on the lights and oil turned off the cash, perestroika exposed the wiring. The country saw the gap between slogans and shelves. The engineers understood it as a control problem without feedback. The accountants understood it as a balance sheet without cash flow. The public understood it as a promise broken at the bakery, the bus stop, the pharmacy counter. Perestroika was supposed to fix the machine. glasnost showed that the machine had been running on borrowed time. By the end of the decade, the reforms hadn't failed because people didn't want change. They failed because change needed prices, property, and patience, and the state's ledger couldn't pay for any of them. Hard currency crisis. Dollars become existential. The moment oil collapsed, dollars turned from convenience to oxygen. The ruble ran the home front, but only hard currency bought the things that kept the machine from seizing. Grain bearings, turbines, precision lathes, chemicals, spare parts for Western rigs already sunk into Siberian mud. Inside Bank, clerks watched a simple ratio ruin plans. Each barrel exported now fetched half the dollars, while contracts written in better times still demanded payment in full. The question changed from what should we import to what must we import to avoid system failure this quarter. Priority lists hardened. Food first. Grain shipments were scheduled like troop movements. Next came the industrial lifelines, process catalysts for refineries, specialty steels, microelectronics batches promised under long-standing deals. Consumer imports fell last in line and often off the list entirely. The public experienced it as empty shelves. The bank tallied it as arrears avoided. To bridge gaps, the state bank sold gold more aggressively. What had been a seasonal valve became a monthly ritual. Bullion out, dollars in, cables flashed to Hamburg, Montreal, Chicago. Each sale carried a signal. Reserves are not a symbol, they are collateral. Creditors read it. European banks that had extended trade credits on oil's reputation began trimming exposure. Tenors shortened, margins crept, and documentation turned fussy. A shipment that once moved on a government guarantee now needed additional assurances. Some lines were rolled with a quiet warning, others were left to mature. It wasn't panic yet, but the tide was going out, and the USSR's swimsuits were the memos the public never saw. Arrears on machinery purchases, rescheduled grain payments, disputed quality claims deployed as bargaining chips to buy time. Meanwhile, hidden inflation at home turned into open pressure on the foreign account. Official prices didn't move, but shortages did. Cooperatives sold at market rates, wages chased scarcity, and ruble liquidity sloshed into any channel that could turn paper into goods. Directors with new autonomy used rubles to hoard inputs. Rubles couldn't cross borders, so the country's true scarcity, dollars, worsened. Barter chains multiplied domestically. Externally, they were useless. A refrigerator could pay for diesel within the Union. It couldn't pay for Canadian wheat. Energy exports offered one stabilizer, gas. Long-term take-or-pay contracts with Europe held better than spot oil. Dollars from gas flowed more predictably, but they didn't cover the whole. Worse, maintaining gas flows required compressor parts and maintenance that increasingly depended on Western suppliers, more dollar outlays to earn dollars. Every hard currency inflow carried a built-in claim on the next outflow. The balance of payments ledger read like a short story with a twist you could see coming and still not avoid. Inside ministries, triage turned granular. A chemical complex in Dzerzhinsk needed imported catalysts to run a reformer that fed aviation fuel output. Without them, aviation fuel fell, squeezing civilian airlines and military training schedules. The catalyst purchase moved to the top of the dollar list, ahead of a machine tool order that would have modernized a plant's line 2 years from now. Investment bowed to upkeep, tomorrow sacrificed to today. The cumulative effect was fatal. Replacement of obsolete equipment slipped another year, then another, ensuring that next year's dollar needs would be larger for the same output. What nobody acknowledged in speeches was that the hard currency crisis exposed the false comfort of the Union's size. 15 republics traded millions of tons of goods internally at planned prices, but none of it settled a single foreign invoice. When republics asserted economic sovereignty, they often withheld deliveries to the center to protect local needs. The center, in turn, had fewer goods to barter for friendly currency or to export for hard currency. The internal web frayed just as the external lifeline thinned. A Minsk electronics factory that once shipped components to Moscow for assembly now demanded cash. Moscow had rubles, the global market wanted dollars. The defense burden, long hidden in euphemisms, became an arithmetic wall. Cutting procurement could free rubles. It didn't free dollars already committed to specialized imports feeding military plants, nor could it be done quickly without idling entire cities. So the burden shifted elsewhere, to civilian imports, to maintenance, to quality. Ships queued longer for spare parts. Aircraft cannibalized less critical fleets. Railroads stretched inspection intervals. Each temporary measure bought a quarter and sold a year. Then came the quiet humiliations. Delegations went to Western capitals to negotiate rescheduling. State entities offered offtake swaps, future oil for present credit gas volumes as surety for machine deliveries. It worked sometimes, but every deal tightened constraints, securitizing the future at discount. The accountants saw it for what it was, asset sales in disguise. Gold bars, forward barrels, guaranteed gas flows. The cupboard inventory shrank. On the street, the crisis wore simpler clothes. Pharmacies posted handwritten signs, no antibiotics, no insulin today. A port crane broke. The replacement gear sourced from abroad was delayed by payments. A bakery shortened hours because the imported enzyme that stabilized flour wasn't delivered. People didn't talk about Vinesh Econombank, they talked about their kids' shoes. By 1989, the narratives crossed. Political sovereignty movements rose as the center failed to supply. Economic sovereignty asserted itself because the center couldn't pay. The hard currency crisis wasn't a headline. It was a daily ration of absence, and by then, everyone inside those ledgers understood the core truth. Dollars had become existential because they priced something the plan never could, time. The Union was running out of it. Republic revolt. Fiscal federalism unravels. While the dollar crisis squeezed from the outside, something inside the Union began to split along its seams. Money that used to flow downhill to Moscow started getting dammed at the source. The republics, long treated as administrative units in a single plan, began acting like fiscal sovereigns. To understand why, follow a tax ruble from a factory floor in Ukraine. For decades, enterprise profits and turnover taxes rose to the union budget, then trickled back through ministries as subsidies, investments, and wage funds. It worked as long as the center could supply fuel, parts, and food on time. By the late 1980s, the center's deliveries faltered. In response, Republican leaders asked a simple question: why send money up if nothing comes back? The first move was legal. Republics passed sovereignty declarations asserting the primacy of Republican law over Union directives in economic matters. On paper, it sounded abstract. In practice, it meant tax payments were rerouted. A Lithuanian plant paid into a Republican account first, then negotiated with Moscow. A Georgian refinery earmarked excise receipts to the Republican budget before sharing the leftover. The center called it illegal withholding. The republics called it self-defense. Meanwhile, ministries in Moscow discovered they couldn't compel shipments the way they once had. A Latvian port authority owed hard currency reimbursements for servicing foreign ships, held back transfers until arrears were cleared. A Kazakh coal combine, starved of equipment, delivered to nearby power stations under bilateral deals with the Republican government rather than fulfill union contracts. The web of planned deliveries, frayed as local leaders, chose certainty at home over obligations to a cashless center. What nobody outside the budget meetings knew was how arithmetic drove politics. The union budget had three anchors: defense, subsidies on staples, and transfers to poorer republics. Defense couldn't be cut quickly. Bread subsidies were politically untouchable. Equalization payments bought peace at the periphery. When oil collapsed and tax inflows thinned, the only lever left was discipline. But discipline needs enforcement and goods to trade. Moscow had less of both. Republics recognized leverage. Russia itself, by far the largest republic, asserted economic sovereignty in 1990, declaring that union laws applied only if they didn't contradict Russian laws. When the core refuses to prioritize the center, everyone else follows. Ukraine demanded a greater share of export earnings from steel and agriculture. Azerbaijan moved to keep more oil revenue at home. Uzbekistan insisted cotton proceeds cover local needs first. Each assertion tightened the noose on the union's cash flow. There were micro moments that made the shift permanent. At a budget conference, a Belarusian finance official presented a ledger showing delayed transfers from Moscow stretching months. "We'll fund pensions locally until arrears clear," he said. The room didn't argue, they took notes. In Yerevan, the Republican government authorized enterprises to settle inter-public trade in goods rather than rubles. Barter replaced budget transfers because rubles didn't move steel or wheat anymore. While that was happening in Kiev, miners in Donbass went on strike. They didn't just demand soap and boots, they demanded the right for their wages to come from enterprise accounts under Republican control. Strikes spread into a political program: decentralize finances, let enterprises negotiate directly, keep proceeds local. The center sent envoys with promises. The miners sent them back with lists of arrears and broken deliveries. The republics read the mood and legislated to match it. Fiscal federalism turned inside out. Instead of a union collecting and redistributing, the republics collected and rationed, and the center came cap in hand. Gosbank branches took instructions from Republican authorities to prioritize local payments. Taxes once earmarked for Moscow were earmarked for schools, hospitals, power plants inside the Republic. The central treasury's cash pool shrank to a puddle. Budget drafts became fiction the moment they were printed. Unknown to many, this revolt reached the border agencies. Customs, once a union function, fell under Republican influence. Ukraine began introducing export controls to prevent its goods from leaving without local approval. Lithuania, asserting independence, set up checkpoints that slowed inter-republic trade. Trucks idled as paperwork proliferated. Factories missed inputs because one republic's new rules delayed another's shipment. It looked like bureaucracy. It was sovereignty asserting itself through stamps and seals. The impact on the hard currency crisis was immediate. Export volumes declined as inter-republic wrangling delayed cargoes. Revenues from union-controlled sales were siphoned by Republican entities that now claimed a share or the whole. Moscow's ability to pledge future exports for credit weakened because it couldn't guarantee control over the goods. Creditors noticed. Negotiations stalled on a question that had never arisen. Who exactly speaks for the union's revenues? There was dramatic irony in the numbers. The union had created a system of transfers to hold the periphery. When the center lost liquidity, the periphery replicated those transfers inward, creating local safety nets while starving the core. A Moldovan finance minister said it plainly behind closed doors. "We are doing at our level what Moscow did at its level, only we can still pay." It wasn't defiance for its own sake, it was arithmetic triage. In the Kremlin, the choice sharpened. Reassert control and risk open confrontation, or concede and shrink de facto before dissolving de jure. Gorbachev pushed a new union treaty to rebalance powers and revenues, to keep a common currency and defense with greater Republican autonomy. On paper, it was a compromise. In reality, the fiscal base that could sustain even a looser union was eroding daily. Each week, more taxes stayed local, more contracts went bilateral, more budgets ignored Moscow. By the time signatures were scheduled, the money had already voted. The union's fiscal heart had stopped beating in Moscow and restarted, weekly and separately, in 15 chests. The accountants didn't need a referendum to know what came next. Hidden inflation goes visible. The price explosion. There'd been inflation for years, only it didn't look like numbers on a price tag. It looked like a line that never moved and a shelf that stayed empty. Economists called it repressed inflation, too much money chasing goods that weren't there, with the pressure bottled up as cues, ration books, favors, and bribes. Under Glasnost, the bottle cracked. Directors had more autonomy, wages drifted up through bonuses and side payments, cooperatives charged what the market would bear, and the rubles the state had printed to keep plants calm now had fewer goods to buy. The pressure finally found an exit: prices. The first signal was subtle and terrifying. Official prices held, but shops began quietly limiting quantities. Clerks kept lists under the counter for regulars. Everyone else met an empty rack. On paper, the state saw stable prices. In kitchens, people tracked inflation as hours lost in line, packets of coffee at twice the real price through a cousin, a coat that couldn't be had for any price unless you knew the warehouse guard. Hidden inflation wore work boots, not a decimal point. Then the co-ops arrived. Legalized small enterprises sold sausage, shoes, and spare parts openly at market rates. It was a miracle and an insult. For the first time, you could buy what you needed without begging, but you'd pay 5-10 times the official price. The wage a factory paid in rubles met a street that priced in scarcity. People called it speculation. Economists called it dual pricing. The lived reality was a two-tiered country. The plan world, where money claimed to be worth something, and the market world, where money discovered what it was. Inside the ministries, the numbers went red. Budget subsidies for staples, bread, milk, transport ballooned because procurement costs rose while shop prices didn't. Every ruble the state spent to hold down the bread price poured more rubles into a system without goods to match. Enterprises begged for higher wholesale prices to cover rising input costs. The state agreed case by case, prying open the lid a little more. Wages chased those costs. The loop tightened. Meanwhile, a quiet shift in pay revealed the breakdown. Work brigades demanded bonuses paid in kind, boots, fuel coupons, food parcels, because rubles were losing meaning. Factory directors hoarded marketable goods for payroll, that starved shops and fed resentment. A rail yard superintendent negotiated to settle a transport debt in refrigerators instead of money. Within days, those fridges showed up at a co-op stall at a price that made a month's salary look small. Cash became a claim, only if you could convert it into stuff quickly. What nobody knew at the time was how close the state came to admitting defeat on paper. Drafts for price reform circulated with tables showing the true cost of staples and the nightmare of letting prices jump to meet it. One version pointed to a 2- to 3-fold rise needed to balance supply and demand. Another, more honest, pointed higher. The political choice was grim: cold turkey liberalization with a burst of visible pain, or continued bottling of inflation that rotted trust. They chose half measures. The market leaked through every hole. Then came the moment people remember as a feeling more than a date. A regional party boss went on television and asked citizens not to panic. Flour deliveries were on the way. The next morning, there was a run on anything that could be stored: sugar, cereals, canned meat. In some cities, administrations introduced ration cards for basics. In others, they printed coupons for soap, detergent, cigarettes. The line shifted from the bakery to the distribution office. The bureaucracy built to suppress prices now built a second economy to track scarcity. It didn't restore confidence. It told everyone the center had lost the map. And across town, something else happened. A co-op opened a small shop selling imported washing powder and chocolate. The line formed before dawn, not because prices were low, but because product existed. A pensioner calculated her month, official bread and milk rations here, one trip to the co-op there, one favor from a neighbor at the warehouse. Her rubles were a puzzle that got harder weekly. For directors, the price explosion meant paralysis wrapped in motion. They could charge more to state buyers on some items, barter others, and pay wages with goods. But the inputs they needed, bearings, catalysts, microchips, were pegged to hard currency outside. Ruble prices could float to the ceiling, and still a missing German pump would stop a line. Inflation in rubles couldn't solve a shortage in dollars. In the aftermath, the statistics finally matched the street. Retail inflation that had once been suppressed burst into official prints as partial liberalizations rippled through regions. The ruble's purchasing power eroded so fast that people abandoned saving. Money burned holes the moment it was paid. Barter took over wholesale trade. Cash retreated to the corners where goods changed hands quickly. The promise of socialism, security, was now a memory measured against a market that arrived like a flood and left mud. The most honest line came from a factory accountant who'd spent his life balancing plans. "We used to lie to keep prices still," he said to a colleague while sorting ration tickets. "Now the truth is moving too fast to count." Hidden inflation had always been there. Glasnost just gave it a mirror. Then the mirror shattered and everyone saw the shards as price. Guns versus butter. The real cost of defense. What nobody said out loud, even under Glasnost, was how the budget was built around a ghost number. Defense lived in annexes, euphemisms, and off-ledger line items, but the burden was felt everywhere. Western estimates put the military share of national output at a staggering slice, deep enough to starve renewal elsewhere. You didn't need the exact figure to see it. You saw it in the housing blocks with peeling stairwells, in the trams rattling on cracked rails, in the hospital wards that still used equipment from the 1960s. The Army's procurement lists were full. The pantry was bare. Start with the basics. The command economy's best metal, precision machine time, and top graduates were rooted to the defense industrial complex by design. Tank factories got first call on alloy steel. Aerospace plants got the pick of microelectronics. Closed cities hoarded metrology tools and clean rooms. Those choices produced real capabilities: ICBMs, air defense systems, submarines with quieter screws after hard-won upgrades. But they also produced a civilian economy that lived on leftovers. When oil money ran thick, the leftover problem could be patched with imports. After 1986, there were no patches left. Then there's Afghanistan. Officially, it was limited. In reality, it was a long-running drain of fuel, vehicles, munitions, airframes, and the logistics to move them across mountains. Every ton flown south was a ton of aviation fuel that didn't move civilian freight. Every spare part diverted to a Hind gunship was a part not available to an Aeroflot repair bay. Casualties came home, so did stress fractures in the maintenance system. The line items didn't say, "Afghanistan ate your bus route," but the effect echoed down the supply chain. Meanwhile, the arms race meter ticked relentlessly. The United States pushed new generations of precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and computing. Matching that meant more design bureaus, more test ranges, more specialized suppliers insulated from market tests. Inside those walls, brilliant work happened. Outside, machine building for the mass economy age. A lathe plant that could have modernized consumer manufacturing instead tooled up under a defense work order. The plan called it prioritization. The worker at a refrigerator factory called it another year fixing the old press with wire and prayer. What nobody knew at the time was how deeply defense distorted investment. In the state's accounts, capital formation for machine building looked healthy, but a huge share of new equipment went to produce other defense equipment, missile cans, airframe components, guidance housings, leaving civilian branches to upgrade by refurbishment. The 1960s modernization tide had already taught managers to polish old iron rather than redesign flows. The 1980s doubled down. Replacement funds were raided to meet military deadlines. Maintenance windows shrank to protect classified lines. Civilian downtime became chronic because someone else's uptime was sacred. There was also the skilled labor drain. Drafting the smartest graduates into closed institutes felt like patriotism and prestige. It also meant fewer top-flight engineers in rail, power distribution, and urban services where incremental improvements would have multiplied. A rail substation could have used a new protection relay. The engineer who would have championed it was debugging avionics in a ministry box. The multiplier that modern economies rely on, spillover from frontier sectors, was capped by secrecy and compartmentalization. On the street, the trade-off wore practical clothes. A city trolleybus fleet hit the end of its service life. The replacement order slipped because the electrical machine plant was at capacity for a radar contract. A hospital requisitioned an ultrasound machine. The delivery date moved twice because the factory had a surge in military orders. A housing block waited 2 winters for new boilers because steel allotments were frozen for a submarine yard. No one signed a memo that said, "Choose missiles over maternity wards." The system chose, month after month. Inside the ministries, the argument turned brutal after the oil crash. Cut defense procurement and risk signaling weakness, or cut civilian imports and watch quality of life nosedive. The leadership tried to shave at the edges, dual-use projects, civilian spin-offs, promises that defense technologies would modernize the mass economy. But spin-offs require open diffusion, supplier networks, and service ecosystem. The defense complex excelled at prototypes and small series. The Soviet civilian economy faltered at mass, reliable, repairable. There was a final accounting trick that fooled fewer people every year. Because the ruble was non-convertible and internal prices were set, defense's share could be presented as tolerable in official rubles. In world prices, the opportunity cost was devastating. Every ruble the state refused to let prices reveal became a dollar the balance of payments had to confess. Oil had papered that over. After 1986, invoices told the story straight. A micro story makes the macro clear. A precision bearing factory received 2 orders, one for a surface-to-air missile platform with exacting tolerances, one for a civilian machine tool upgrade that would have improved yields at dozens of plants. The ministry prioritized the missile. The bearing plant met the plan. The machine tool plant limped another year. Multiply that across alloys, optics, semiconductors, and metrology, and you get the shape of the economy by the late 1980s. Sharp edges turned toward the enemy, blunt edges turned toward the citizen. By then, even insiders admitted the corner they were in. You can't eat deterrence. You can't heat an apartment with a parade. And in a system built to count inputs, prestige projects always won. The bill arrived not as a number in a defense annex, but as an empty pharmacy shelf and a train that didn't come. Eastern Bloc, Dominoes. Subsidies, debts, Revolt. While Moscow rationed dollars at home, it was still paying other people's bills abroad. The Eastern Bloc hadn't just been an ideological project. It was an economic one stitched together with subsidized energy, soft credits, and barter priced far from world markets. For years, the arrangement bought loyalty. After 1986, it became a tab the Union could no longer pick up. Start with the pipeline politics. Comecon partners received oil and gas at administered prices, often below global levels, and settled in transferable rubles. In return, they shipped machinery, chemicals, and consumer goods back to the USSR, goods that looked good on paper, but often cost more in inputs than they were worth. As long as Soviet barrels fetched high prices in the West, the subsidy could be hidden in accounting. When Brent fell into the teens, each ton sold cheaply to Warsaw or East Berlin represented dollars the budget didn't earn and couldn't spend on grain or bearings. There was a second, quieter subsidy, hard currency credits. The USSR extended support to keep Allied regimes solvent, rolled trade imbalances, and tolerated arrears. Poland's debt crisis in the early 1980s had already signaled the hazard. Restructuring deals with Western banks made Warsaw more cautious. Moscow kept the energy flowing to prevent a political collapse next door. Hungary liberalized at the margins and leaned on Soviet input. East Germany delivered precision goods back to the USSR, but its own foreign debts mounted as it bought Western technology to sustain quality. The center pretended the circle closed. The ledger said otherwise. By the late 1980s, the math tightened. Soviet ministries pressed Comecon to move toward world prices or at least something closer on energy. Partners balked. Their factories had been built on cheap Soviet inputs. A price shock would cascade through wages and shelves. Negotiations produced transitional formulas, but the direction was clear. The subsidy would shrink because it had to. That alone strained regimes already juggling shortages and legitimacy. Then politics put numbers on the street. In Poland, solidarity resurfaced as more than a union. It became a balance sheet audit of a system that couldn't supply. Strikes and roundtable talks led to semi-free elections in 1989. The message across the bloc was simple. The center's ability to pay for order had faded. In Hungary, reformers opened the border, triggering an exodus of East Germans through Austria. East Berlin faced a choice between repression and insolvency. Crowds chose neither. The wall cracked and then fell, and with it an entire structure of administered trade. What nobody outside trade ministries saw in real time was how quickly the Comecon clearing system turned toxic. Transferable rubles, once a lubricant, became a claim on goods nobody wanted at agreed prices. As partners pivoted toward the West, they demanded hard currency or world price settlement. The USSR could offer gas under long-term contracts. It couldn't conjure dollars for everything else. Barter deals proliferated, then failed as trust collapsed. Warehouses in Moscow filled with East German appliances that citizens couldn't afford and no longer desired, while the inputs to keep Soviet plants running were delayed by payment disputes. East Germany's absorption into the Federal Republic in 1990 delivered the coup de grace to the Comecon core. The GDR had been the bloc's reliable, high-quality supplier and a steady buyer of Soviet energy. Overnight, its trade reoriented to the DM zone. Soviet deliveries lost a captive market. The Union lost a partner that had masked some of its own consumer deficits. Compensation talks produced promises and transitional arrangements. None matched the speed of collapse. Meanwhile, Romania and Czechoslovakia saw their own reckonings. Regimes fell, new governments looked westward. Energy contracts were rewritten, debts were tallied in hard currency. The USSR, already selling gold faster to pay for wheat and parts, now faced shrinking soft markets and rising cash demands. A subsidy that once bought political quiet now bought nothing. The external empire had become a drain with no return. Inside the Kremlin, the choice was brutal. Keep subsidizing and starve the home front, or pull the plug and watch allies revolt faster. The leadership tried to taper. Reality jumped. The image of Soviet power, tanks, treaties, parades, met customs posts, bank drafts, and credit committees. Borders stayed, balances shifted. And once the dominoes fell, the Union's last asset, its role as the indispensable hub, evaporated. Partners stopped asking what Moscow could supply and started asking what it could pay. There's a micro-story that captures the macro collapse. A Soviet negotiator in Vienna met a Hungarian counterpart to roll a pipeline arrears. For years, they'd papered over gaps with clearing balances and promises. This time, the Hungarian slid a piece of paper across the table. World price, dollar settlement, 30-day terms. The Soviet asked for 90. The Hungarian shook his head. We have to pay in real money now. The negotiator understood. The bloc had been an overdraft. The bank had closed. 1991, the final audit. It didn't look like an audit at first. It looked like empty trains, silent factories, and a currency people tried to spend before lunch lost value by dinner. But 1991 was exactly that, a reckoning where every deferred cost, every hidden subsidy, and every optimistic memo landed on one table with no cash left in the drawer. Start with the ledger everyone pretended wasn't a ledger, the Union budget. Revenues shrank as republics kept taxes local, expenditures ballooned as subsidies, pensions, and wages were paid with rubles that bought less each week. The draft numbers told a story even the drafters didn't believe: deficits that couldn't be financed, arrears that couldn't be rolled, promises that couldn't be met. Ministries wrote requests as if the old world still existed. The Treasury stamped approvals that meant little. Gosbank branches, now listening to Republican authorities, rationed payments. The center's seal on a document no longer moved goods or trains or men. Foreign accounts, the real scoreboard, turned brutal. Arrears on machinery orders stacked up. Grain shipments came only against prepayment or guarantees none could sign without a sovereign behind them. Gold sales, accelerated for 2 years, scraped the bottom of vaults that were never supposed to be collateral. Delegations went to European capitals with spreadsheets and pleading. Credit committees returned with conditions the union couldn't satisfy because it no longer controlled the very exports it was pledging. When banks asked, "Who speaks for your barrels and your gas?" the answer changed with the week. Inside enterprises, cash vanished into barter chains so tangled that directors kept chalkboards just to track who owed whom a railcar of coal, a truckload of tires, a shipment of copper. Wages were paid partly in goods. Workers carried home sacks of sugar instead of rubles because sugar could be traded for boots or fuel or antibiotics. The official price lists, still printed, still posted, became wall art. Value had moved into basements and stairwells, where neighbors swapped necessities and reckoned fairness by feel. Politically, the calendar offered one last attempt to balance a collapsing equation: a new union treaty. It promised autonomy to republics, a common currency, a shared defense, and some coordinated revenues, enough on paper to keep a frame. The accountants around it knew the base was gone. Russia, the largest taxpayer and resource holder, had already asserted legal primacy. Ukraine was writing its own budget. The Baltics had stepped out. Even if signatures came, there was no pool of money to make the clauses real. Then August made the audit visual. Tanks in Moscow, a committee declaring order, communications jammed, television confused. For 3 days, the country saw the old reflex: seize the center, command the periphery. But the periphery had already detached in practice. The coup collapsed not only because crowds stood and soldiers hesitated, but because the machine it tried to restart no longer had fuel. When the plotters fell, so did the last pretense that the center could enforce a plan with paper and parades. After that, ledgers turned into declarations. Republic after republic announced independence, not as theory, but as accounting. They took ownership of tax streams, enterprises, borders, and customs posts. Interrepublic deliveries, already frayed, snapped. The common budget emptied in days. The ruble area, an abstract promise of shared money, became a patchwork of surcharges, coupons, and local rules. A director in Kharkiv faxed an order to a supplier in Perm and received a reply he had never seen: prepayment in convertible currency or no shipment. He showed it to his workers. They laughed, then went home early to barter. Western observers talked about geopolitics. Inside the ministries, people counted insulin vials, locomotive axles, and the days until coal stockpiles hit zero. Aeroflot ground crews cannibalized one fleet to keep another flying. Port cranes broke and stayed broken. Pharmacies posted lists of drugs they didn't have, and the lists got longer. It wasn't ideology that ended the union. It was that invoices no longer matched inventories, and no one could bridge the gap. By December 1991, the last entries wrote themselves. Leaders met and agreed to dissolve what the numbers had already erased. The red flag would come down, a new tricolor would go up. But the truest ceremony had happened months earlier, when a customs officer in a newly assertive republic stamped a form that sent a train back across a border that had never existed before, and the train actually turned around. That was the final audit. Assets and liabilities reassigned. The balance closed. When the accountants locked the cabinet, there was one line left to read. For years, oil, secrecy, and fear funded a system that couldn't price truth. In 1991, truth sent the bill. And the country, already sold piece by piece to yesterday, couldn't pay for tomorrow. Early death certificate, mid-1980s data. The accountants had a name for it long before politicians did: the gap. In internal tables from 1985-1987, growth had a pulse, but productivity was flat to falling. Total factor productivity, the part of growth not explained by piling in more labor and capital, slipped below zero. The machine only moved when you fed it more steel, more fuel, more bodies. When inputs paused, output sagged. That's not slowdown, that's organ failure. There was a second column that told the same story. Defense, long treated as a state secret, showed up in planning annexes as a share so large it couldn't be offset elsewhere. Western estimates often put it in the mid-teens to mid-20s% of national output by the mid-1980s. Internal ruble prices disguised it, but procurement queues didn't. When budget drafts modeled a cut, the civilian backlog barely budged because maintenance and basic imports were already rationed. The room understood. There was no butter to shift back from guns. Hidden inflation figures rounded the picture. Repressed price pressure, once contained in queues, was estimated in the double digits. Wage funds had outpaced retail supply for years. When partial liberalization scenarios were run, the implied one-time jump to clear markets was politically suicidal. So the lid stayed on, and shortages did the math instead. On the external page, the balance of payments lines flashed red. Oil revenue sensitivities at $15 a barrel forecast an unbridgeable dollar gap. Gold sale schedules filled the remainder, then ran out of bars by 1990-1991. Debt service ratios crept toward thresholds banks used as tripwires. Memos from Vinesh Econombank flagged acute constraint on prepayments for grain and catalyst. And then a demographic table arrived. Male life expectancy sliding back toward the early 1960s, productivity losses from alcohol measured in workdays, industrial accidents ticked up with aging equipment. The state's capital, human and physical, was depreciating faster than it could be replaced. The verdict wasn't ideological, it was arithmetic. By 1986, the ledger read, insolvent, the politics just caught up later. Aftermath, shock of the 1990s and data blind spots. The morning after the funeral came with price tags. Shops that had never been allowed to tell the truth about value suddenly did, and the numbers jumped like a heartbeat coming back too fast. In January 1992, price controls were lifted on most goods in Russia. The move cleared the queues but replaced them with sticker shock. Rubles that had been a ration coupon inside a command system were asked to behave like money. They weren't ready. People watched their savings shrink week by week as inflation sprinted ahead of pay. It felt like theft because, in a way, it was. Years of repressed inflation, hidden subsidies, and bad balance sheets were settled in the open, and the bill walked straight through the door of every kitchen. Enterprises stumbled into a world where bankruptcy existed as more than a rumor. Under soft budgets, a bad month brought a phone call. Under hard budgets, it brought closure. Directors who'd mastered the art of planned bargaining now had to sell to customers and borrow from banks that wanted their money back. Many failed. The industrial base, which the old system had kept running by pouring in inputs, met a market that measured usefulness instead. Factories with obsolete equipment and no demand found out that survival had been subsidized sentiment. Shocks rippled through towns built around one plant, then down household ledgers already thin from price liberalization. Privatization arrived as a solution and a scramble. Vouchers were handed out as a promise of ownership. Schemes were devised to turn ministries into markets. On paper, it was mass capitalism. In practice, insiders with information and access could concentrate assets faster than new institutions could guard against it. Oligarchs emerged from the mix, some former factory directors, some nomenclature-adjacent fixers, some pure opportunists, backed by banks born in a week and wired into ministries still staffed by people from the old world. The state's property changed hands at a pace that outstripped the court's ability to referee. A public that had never owned anything collectively in a meaningful way watched ownership happen to them, not with them. Meanwhile, the statistical floor dropped out from under policymakers. The Soviet system had been a master at producing numbers that fit a plan. When the plan vanished, so did the ability to measure in the old categories. National material product, the central aggregate that ignored services and mispriced much of the rest, was retired. GDP, the global yardstick, had to be built from sources that didn't exist or couldn't be trusted yet. Small businesses appeared and disappeared without registration. Barter replaced cash in wholesale trade. Regional authorities issued coupons and surcharges that blurred what counted as money. The country needed data to steer. It was flying through fog without instruments calibrated to the new sky. Some of the blind spots were deliberate. Enterprises hiding profits to avoid taxes, regional governments shielding assets from the center, banks moving capital offshore as fast as they learned how. The incentives pushed information into the shadows. Some were structural. When half your economy settles debts in goods, surveys don't catch it, and central bankers can't model it. Monetary policy felt like pumping air into a tire with holes no one could locate. Fiscal policy felt like writing a budget on water. The social costs were visible in the kind of numbers that do get counted. Male life expectancy dropped. Alcohol returned as an escape and a trade item. Hospitals lost doctors to private clinics and emigration. Schools watched teachers take second jobs that were really first jobs in terms of hours. The promise that pain would be short met winters that weren't. People adjusted by building informal insurance. Family networks, side hustles, plots of land outside cities where potatoes could be planted and harvested even if the ruble stumbled. Survival moved into the space where the state had once stood. There were bright spots, but they were uneven. In some cities, markets brought dynamism. A new restaurant on a street that had never had one, a kiosk selling parts you could never find before, a computer club where kids learned skills unimaginable in the 1980s. In others, lights went out early, and the only new construction was fences. The oil price, that old silent partner, climbed at the end of the decade and gave the state breathing room again. Revenues stabilized. Salaries were paid on time. The sense that tomorrow might be better returned to parts of the map. What nobody wanted to admit publicly, at least at first, was that some of the chaos wasn't the shock itself, but the inheritance. Gaidar's argument that shock therapy was less a choice than a forced landing given the fuel left clashed with those who saw a different path through gradualism. Åslund pointed to institutions as the missing scaffolding. Goldman warned that privatization without a small business base would create concentrated power. Pipes highlighted how centralized control and ideology had long suppressed incentives and flexibility. They were arguing different facets of the same reality. A state that had stopped pricing truth had to start, and starting would hurt no matter how you did it. There were also lessons in the way data lied and then went silent. For decades, secrecy and accounting conventions had hidden the cost of choices: defense over dwellings, steel over services, subsidies over savings. When markets forced prices to speak, the sound came out as a scream. The 1990s were the echo of the mid-1980s verdict we saw in those internal tables. Negative productivity, an external account dependent on commodity swings, a demographic slide. The reforms didn't cause those lines. They revealed them and then wrestled with the consequences in public. In the end, the aftershock taught something simple and hard. You can defer arithmetic with power for a long time. You can't cancel it. The task after collapse wasn't to resurrect the past with better managers. It was to build a system that didn't need secrecy to balance, that could tell itself the truth in numbers and survive it. That work started in the 1990s in chaos. In many ways, it's still unfinished. Resolution and meaning. The Soviet Union didn't die in December 1991. It bled out on spreadsheets years earlier when math outran myth. If you want more stories where the numbers whisper before history shouts, subscribe and watch the next episode on how one oil price chart rewired an empire. For deeper dives into sources and the people inside these decisions, check the links and join the channel.